She didn't cry when they left her. Just stood there, arms around a burlap doll, toes pressed to the frozen dirt outside the church steps. Her name was Sadie, but no one in town knew that yet. Not the pastor, not the women who passed by whispering, not even the man who eventually bent down to eye level. The note pinned to her threadbare dress flapped in the wind. 3 words scrawled in charcoal. "She's yours now." She didn't know who had written it. She only knew that her mama had kissed her forehead that morning, told her to be brave, and walked away down the path with her back straight and shoulders shaking. That kiss still tingled. It was all she had left. The townsfolk didn't know what to make of her. A child abandoned in the open. No name, no kin. Some muttered about sending her to the orphanage 2 counties over. Others suggested letting the sheriff deal with it. But no one stepped forward. Until he did. Jedediah Ward, a rancher with a history carved in silence and scars. He didn't speak when he lifted the note from her chest. He read it once, then looked at her face. His hand trembled slightly as he folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Come on," he finally said, voice gravel low but not unkind. She followed, not because she trusted him, but because his shadow didn't make her flinch the way others did. His boots crunched slow and certain as they left the crowd behind. He didn't ask questions, didn't press her to speak, just helped her onto his horse and wrapped his coat around her small frame. From the saddle, she looked back once. At the empty church steps, the place where she'd stopped being someone's daughter and started being someone else's mystery. The ride was quiet. Snowflakes floated through the dusk. He glanced at her once, then again, and said, "You warm enough?" She nodded, though she wasn't. At the edge of his ranch, the gate creaked open like it hadn't in years. He dismounted first, then lifted her down gently like glass. "This place ain't much," he said, leading her towards the porch. "But it's honest. You hungry?" She didn't answer, just clung tighter to her doll. But something in her chest shifted. Not safety, not yet, but maybe the whisper of it. Maybe. Sadie sat in the corner of the cabin that first night, curled into a quilt that smelled of hay and wood smoke. She hadn't taken her boots off. Didn't know if she was meant to stay. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and the rancher, Jedediah, moved about the space with a kind of quiet rhythm, as if trying not to stir ghosts. He ladled stew into a chipped bowl and placed it on the table near her. "Eat when you're ready," he said, before walking outside to tend the horses. She waited 5 whole minutes, then moved to the table. The food was warm and thick, and though it wasn't familiar, it filled the hollow in her stomach like nothing had in days. When Jed returned, he didn't comment on the empty bowl, just nodded slightly, and sat in the chair across from her, setting down a worn pair of girl's boots, smaller than his, but clean. "They belonged to my niece," he said. "She's grown now. Thought maybe they'd fit you better than those rags." Sadie didn't speak. Her voice had folded into itself after the goodbye. But she took the boots, holding them like they might disappear. She hadn't had anything of her own in months. "You don't have to say anything," Jed said gently. "But if you do, I'll listen." He didn't push, didn't ask where she came from or what the note meant. He simply sat beside her, whittling a block of wood into a horse, humming under his breath. It was the kind of quiet that didn't hurt. That night he set up a cot by the stove, layering it with wool blankets. "You'll be warmer here," he said. She nodded and lay down slowly, pulling the covers over her ears. Jed moved to his room, leaving the door cracked open. Just in case. At some point she crept from the cot and tiptoed to his door, watching him sleep. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Proof of kindness, maybe, or the rhythm of someone who didn't leave. In the morning, she found a wooden horse at the foot of her bed, carved in silence, left without fanfare. She picked it up and held it to her chest. She still hadn't said a word. But when Jed asked, "You hungry?" her nod came quicker, and when he smiled, she almost did too. Almost. By the third day, Sadie had started sweeping the cabin floor on her own. Not because Jed asked, he never did, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just careful, like they were both learning how not to break something fragile. Jed came in from the barn with dust on his hat and hay in his sleeves. "You been busy?" he said with a nod at the newly tidied hearth. She shrugged and kept brushing. But when she looked up, his eyes were soft with something like pride. That afternoon, while Jed rode into town for supplies, Sadie wandered through the cabin. Every creaking board seemed to whisper stories she wasn't sure she was allowed to hear. In the corner of the room was an old chest of drawers, the top one half open. Curiosity tugged at her fingers. She slid it the rest of the way and found a stack of folded linens, a broken compass, and a letter, yellowed with time, addressed in the same handwriting she'd seen on her own note. She froze. The letter was worn at the corners, clearly read and reread, but still whole. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The words inside trembled in neat cursive. "Jed, she's not mine. You know that. But I couldn't leave her with them. You always said you wanted to fix something broken. Here she is. Fix her if you can. Or just love her." "That's better." Sadie's breath caught in her throat. It was about her. That much was clear. The note hadn't been written by someone who hated her, but someone who knew she needed more than they could give. She folded the letter back up and placed it exactly as she'd found it. When Jed returned, she was sitting at the table, her back straight, hands folded. He noticed the drawer. He didn't scold her, just set down the sugar and beans and said, "Guess you saw it." Sadie finally spoke. Just 2 words. Software brittle. "Was it true?" Jed sat across from her, his voice like gravel smoothed by rain. "Every word." She didn't ask who wrote it. She didn't need to. "Why did you take me in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jed didn't blink. "Because nobody should be left with just a note." Sadie didn't cry, but her hands trembled on the edge of the table. And that night, when he asked if she wanted to help bake bread the next day, she whispered, "Yes." It was the first thing she'd chosen in a long, long time. The next morning, before the sun had fully climbed the ridge, Sadie woke to the sound of hammering. At first, she thought it was a dream, the kind that slips through cracks in the dawn. But when she peeked through the curtain, she saw Jed outside with his sleeves rolled, working on the old storage shed beside the cabin. She watched him for a long time, unsure whether to go out or stay invisible like she always had. But something about the rhythm of his movements, the way he paused to measure, how he never muttered in frustration, how he seemed to be building with purpose instead of just fixing something broken, made her feet move. "What's that for?" she asked quietly, stepping outside. Jed didn't look up. "Room," he said. "For you. Cabin's got space, but a girl should have her own." She stared at him, disbelieving. No one had ever made room for her before, only rules, corners, chores, and silence. Not room, not space to grow. She stood frozen, half thinking he might change his mind, but he just kept hammering, like her presence there was normal, expected, welcome. By evening, the structure had walls and a roof, and when she stepped inside, it smelled like pine and hope. The floor was rough, the window small, but to Sadie it was the grandest place in the world. That night, she lay in the cot Jed had moved in for her, staring at the beams overhead. There were no shadows filled with shouting, No creaking floors followed by angry footsteps. Just wind and quiet, and the faint sound of a horse nickering nearby. The safety of it felt strange, heavy, like a blanket she hadn't realized she needed. She got up once just to check that the door still opened. It did. Jed had even put a latch on it, from the inside. A choice. A door she could close if she wanted to. When she sat back on the cot, she saw something tucked under her pillow. A book. Not new, not fancy, but thick and bound in cracked leather. Inside was a name written in faded ink. Eleanor McKay. Sadie didn't know who that was, but on the first page, written in Jed's blocky handwriting, were 3 words. "Read this, Sadie." No one had ever told her to read before. No one had ever thought she might want to. She traced the letters with her finger and whispered them back to herself. This room, this book, this day, it wasn't just shelter. It was the beginning of something she'd never dared to believe in. A life of her own. Sadie began to notice things. Jed didn't just work hard. He worked deliberately. Every nail he hammered had purpose. Every animal he tended moved calmer in his presence. He didn't speak unless he needed to, but when he did, his words mattered. She watched him one afternoon from the porch as he gently reset the leg of an injured foal, humming so low it was more vibration than song. There was a softness in him that didn't match his size or the weather-worn lines on his face. That night, over supper, beans, cornbread, and apples from the root cellar, Sadie asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue for days. "Why'd you take me in?" Jed chewed slowly, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, "Because I was taken in once." He didn't offer more, but the silence didn't feel closed off. It felt like a door left ajar. Sadie knew better than to push. Instead, she waited. 2 days later, the rest came. It was after dusk, the sky the color of coal dust. Jed was mending tack in the barn when he spoke without turning. "I was 8 when my folks died. House fire. No one claimed me. Lived with a man for 2 years. Said he'd feed me if I worked. Didn't say he'd whip me when I didn't." His voice didn't shake, but Sadie felt it in her bones. "I ran, slept in feed sheds, stole biscuits off windowsills, until one day a woman with gray hair and a mule wagon stopped me mid-run and asked if I was tired yet." He finally looked at Sadie. She didn't ask what I'd done, just if I wanted to stop running. Sadie nodded, her throat tight. "And now you're doing that for me?" He shrugged. "Something like that. Maybe just balancing the scale." For the first time, Sadie saw Jed not just as a rancher or a quiet man with calloused hands, but as someone who had once needed the very thing he now offered. Not charity, not pity. Shelter with dignity. She moved closer, took a chance, and said, "Then maybe I'll balance it too, someday." Jed didn't smile much, but his eyes did. That night, Sadie lay in her cot, holding the leather book close, thinking not of the past, but of the future. A future not decided by the note pinned to her dress, or by men who bartered girls like goods, but by moments like this. Quiet, strong, and human. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a transaction. She was becoming someone, and she wasn't alone. The morning light was soft when Sadie found it. She was sweeping behind the storage shelf in the barn when a folded paper slipped from between 2 feed sacks and floated to the dirt floor. Curious, she picked it up. Her name wasn't on it, but neither was anyone else's. It was old, creased, written in careful but rough handwriting. She knew she shouldn't, but something in her chest told her it was part of her story now. She sat in the straw and began to read. "To the man who finds her, if anyone does, I'm sorry. I couldn't keep her. She deserved more than a hungry mouth and a mother who barely made it through the winter. She never cried, not once. Even when I wrapped her in the old blanket, even when I pinned this to her, she just looked up at me with eyes like her father's. I hope she finds a name, a roof, and someone who tells her she belongs. Please, if you can, don't let her forget she was loved." The paper trembled in her hand. Not from the wind, but from something inside her breaking and healing at the same time. It wasn't just a note anymore. It was a mother's last gift. A desperate hope pinned to a dress. And now Sadie held it with the same fingers that had clutched the rail of that porch in the dark. She didn't tell Jed right away. Instead, she placed the letter in the small wooden box she kept under her cot, alongside the leather-bound book and the hair ribbon she no longer wore. That evening, while Jed was working the fence line, Sadie walked out to meet him. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him, watching the horizon where orange and purple melted into night. After a while, she spoke. "Did you ever forgive the people who left you?" He leaned on the post and looked at her for a long time. "Took a while to understand they weren't leaving me. They were just trying to save what little of me they could." Sadie nodded. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and handed him the letter. Jed read it without a word. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "Now it's yours," he said. "Not just something that happened to you, something you survived." That night, Sadie didn't cry. She didn't ache. She just lay there, staring at the stars through the window. And for the first time since she could remember, she knew where she came from, didn't decide where she was going. The thunder cracked just past midnight, shaking the rafters as wind tore at the shutters. Sadie had never liked storms, not because they were loud, but because they made her remember the night she was left on that porch. Rain always smelled like goodbye. But this time, as she stood at the window watching the downpour blur the world, she felt something else. Something that had grown slowly since the day Jed called her daughter. She felt safe. Jed's boots echoed down the hall. He opened the door to her room, holding a lantern. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but he stepped in anyway. "Storm's a mean one. Might be a long night." Sadie looked at the lantern glow on his weathered face. "Can I stay in the parlor with you?" she asked. Jed smiled like he'd been waiting her whole life to hear those words. They sat by the hearth, him in his chair, her curled on the rug with a blanket around her shoulders. The fire crackled, and the storm roared outside, but inside that little room, time softened. Jed told her about a summer flood from years ago, when the barn roof blew off, and he had to sleep in the pantry with 2 goats. Sadie laughed until she hiccuped. Then she told him about the place she'd been before. Just fragments. A dry room with a cracked ceiling, a woman who always whispered instead of speaking, and the silence that came when she left. Jed listened like her memories mattered. When lightning flashed, Sadie flinched, and Jed reached down to gently place his hand over hers. "You're not alone now," he said. "Whatever storm comes, we face it together." Outside, wind tore a shutter loose. It clanged against the house. Jed moved quickly, grabbing his coat. "Stay here," he said, but Sadie stood up beside him. "Let me help," she said firmly. Together they braved the rain, tying the shutter down, soaked to the bone, but laughing like fools once it was done. As they came back inside, dripping wet, Jed looked at her and said, "You're braver than most men I know." She shrugged, shivering. "You taught me." That night, Sadie slept not in her bed, but on the sofa by the hearth, wrapped in warm quilts, the scent of wood smoke and rain clinging to her. She no longer feared storms, because now every crack of thunder reminded her, not of being abandoned, but of the night she chose to stand beside the man who had chosen her first. Spring brought color back to the ranch. Green creeping up the hills, yellow flowers poking through old fences, and Sadie's laughter echoing through the barn as she helped with the colts. Jed had started calling her Kiddo, and sometimes, when he forgot himself, my girl. She never corrected him. One quiet afternoon, while sweeping the front room, Sadie knocked over an old box tucked beneath the low shelf near Jed's desk. Papers spilled across the floor, receipts, envelopes, yellowing maps. But one small folded note caught her eye. She didn't mean to pry, she only wanted to clean up. But something about the careful way it was tucked, like it had been hidden rather than stored, made her pause. She opened it. The handwriting was looping and smudged. Just 5 words. Please give her a chance. Her hands trembled. It was written in pencil. On the back, a name she barely remembered, Miss Eleanor Bright, the name of the teacher from the church who used to offer her biscuits after Sunday services, and who vanished 1 week later. She stood frozen, the paper soft and old in her hand. Jed entered from outside, brushing hay from his shirt. He saw her holding it and stopped. Their eyes met. You found it, he said, not surprised. Was it her who left me? Sadie asked. Jed walked slowly to her, took the note, looked at it like it still carried weight. Miss Bright brought you here that night. Said you had no one left, but she wasn't strong enough to keep you herself. She cried the whole walk back down the road. And you just took me in? Number I almost didn't, he said, voice low. I didn't think I knew how, but then I saw you on the porch, curled up like you were already used to being left. I couldn't walk away from that. Sadie sat down on the rug, legs folded beneath her. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was waiting for you to want to stay, not because you had to, but because you chose to. She looked up at him. I did. Jed kneeled in front of her and said, Then that note doesn't matter anymore. We write our own story now. She nodded, but later that evening she carefully placed the note in a little box and tied it with a ribbon. Not to remember who abandoned her, but to never forget the moment she truly belonged. The knock came just after breakfast, when Sadie was helping Jed shell peas on the porch. It wasn't urgent, not loud, but firm. Jed's shoulders stiffened before he even turned. A man in a long coat stood at the gate, gray-bearded, holding a black satchel and a folded paper in one hand. Jedediah Kane? The man asked. Yes, Jed said warily, standing. I'm Judge Harrow, out of Carson County. Jed exchanged a glance with Sadie, who sat frozen, a pea pod half open in her hand. The judge stepped forward. I came because of a letter, one written by a Miss Eleanor Bright 2 years ago. It concerned a girl abandoned with no known kin. Jed nodded slowly, voice guarded. She's here. The judge studied Sadie, her posture, the plain dress she wore, the neat braids in her hair. You've kept her all this time? Not kept, Jed said. Raised. She's my daughter now, in every way that matters. Harrow took out the folded paper. Miss Bright passed away last winter. Among her belongings, this note was found, urging the court to verify the girl's safety and consider formal guardianship, should a good man be found. He looked again at Sadie, then back at Jed. Some of us feared she might have been mistreated. Sadie stood then, gently but with fire in her eyes. He gave me more than any name ever did, she said. He gave me warmth, safety, a home. I wasn't even his, and he still taught me how to ride and read and build fences. He sat up all night when I had fever. He let me cry without asking why. He never asked me to earn it. He just stayed. The judge listened, then nodded solemnly. I've seen enough. He reached into his satchel and pulled out another sheet, this one with a golden seal. This is for you, Mr. Kane. Official guardianship. As far as the law's concerned, she's yours. Jed's eyes didn't shine often, but they did then. He took the paper, hands unsteady. Sadie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding and threw her arms around him. Thank you, Jed said quietly. The judge tipped his hat. I reckon the thanks belongs to you both. Some folks raise bloodkin and still get it wrong. But this was done right. When the judge rode away, the porch felt warmer than the sun could make it. The world had come knocking. But instead of taking her, it had finally recognized what Sadie already knew. She was home, and no one could change that now. Years later, the note was still folded beneath the lining of Sadie's sewing box. She could have thrown it away. It was stained and torn, the ink nearly faded. But it was hers, the first proof that someone once cared enough to plead for her future, and the last piece of the life she'd been abandoned from. That note, pinned to her dress when she was left, had once defined her. Now it reminded her how far she'd come. The ranch had changed, too. Jed built another bedroom, then a schoolhouse out back where Sadie taught a handful of neighbor children their letters and kindness. She read them stories beneath the elm tree, stories about courage, choice, and second chances. Stories she once thought were for other girls. Not anymore. On Sundays, she baked bread and rode into town beside Jed, still calling him Pa like it had always been that way. People greeted her now. They knew her not as the girl with the note, but as Sadie Kane, the schoolmistress, the rancher's daughter, the heart of a place that once nearly broke her. One summer afternoon, a stranger came down the road. A woman, worn from travel, clutching the hand of a small boy. You don't know me, the woman said. But I heard there's a girl here who was taken in when no one else would. Sadie looked at the child, saw the same lost spark she once carried. She didn't ask why. She only nodded and said, Come inside. You both look hungry. That night, as the boy fell asleep on the rug with a blanket around his shoulders, Sadie sat at the table and unfolded the old note one more time. It still read, Her name is Sadie. Please be kind. She's better than the world has been to her. She pressed her palm to it and closed her eyes. That note had once felt like a curse. Now it was a promise she had fulfilled. Not just because someone loved her, but because she chose to become everything the world told her she couldn't be. When Jed joined her, she passed him the note. He smiled and slid it back into her box. Still keeping it? He asked. She nodded. It reminds me where I started, and why I'll never let someone else fall the way I did. He kissed the top of her head and whispered, That's my girl. The wind moved softly through the open window. Somewhere in the house, a child who wasn't hers, but maybe would be, dreamed safely. And the note, tucked quietly away, rested like a sealed chapter of a story that had finally found its ending. A story of a girl left behind, and a family that refused to leave her there. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had read that note pinned to her dress, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments.